think you'll agree that we live in a world that is filled with conflict, both on a national and international scale, but also even at times at a local scale. So what I want to do today is to discuss 3 practices from early Buddhism that might be helpful in overcoming conflict, at least at the local level, and then hopefully that will propagate outwards. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find videos, courses about early Buddhism. I just have a new course out now on the Eightfold Spiral Path and Ascent Towards Freedom. So you might want to take a look at that. But in any event, if you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So I think part of the, I would say the most difficult problem that we're dealing with nowadays is conflict, and that's something that's been with us throughout human history, of course. In the Buddha's early analysis of conflict, of the origins of conflict, the causal conditioning behind conflict, he sees it as originating in our emotional attachment to our way that we perceive the world to be, or the way that we perceive that the world should be. And that is to say that conflict arises in our attachment, our emotional attachment to our views and opinions, to our ideas. And so what I should say, how that is resolved, how that comes up in our lives, is that we find ourselves becoming obsessed by particular ideas. When we entertain certain ideas that are emotionally difficult for us or emotionally important for us, we get caught in mental proliferation, what's known as mental proliferation in early Buddhism. We get caught in this kind of rumination, these difficult thoughts that repeat themselves over and over again in different fashions, trying to say the same thing to us, that keep repeating themselves until we act on them. That is to say, they're this kind of mental chatter that repeats and repeats, that tries to force us in a certain respect to act, to do things. And oftentimes, the action that we take based on this kind of mental rumination is not to our benefit. In fact, it's to our detriment, or to the detriment of people around us. What this obsessive thinking tends to do is to present the world to us in various ways that appears crystal clear. And it appears crystal clear because it's being repeated to us by our own minds, by our mental operations again and again and again. And so hearing it in our own minds again and again, we begin to take it as, we might say, gospel. We begin to take it as something that's crystal clear, even though it often isn't, even though, in fact, it often is a kind of delusion. So, for example, we may have an interaction with somebody, and after that interaction, we may be tormented by thoughts that we have to strike back, that we have to, let's say we disagree about some fundamental thing. We are often obsessed by thoughts that we have to get in the last word, that we have to yell loud enough in order to change the other person's mind, that if we only yelled louder, if we only said that one last thing, we would change their minds and we would all be in agreement. Now, I say that that's a delusion because in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, there isn't anything that we can say that's going to change somebody's mind. And certainly saying it louder or for the 10th time is going to be even less likely to be successful. But that's the way our mental operations, our mental obsessions tend to present the world to us. That there's just this one last thing that has to be done and then everything will be right. So that's the dilemma that we're in. The question is, how do we overcome this dilemma? Now, the Buddha, in fact, in an early, famous early text, discusses the way out of this dilemma. He discusses a particular root, which we'll be discussing in this video in various aspects. What the Buddha says is, if a person doesn't find anything worth approving, welcoming, or getting attached to in this source from which these mental proliferations arise, just this is the end of the underlying tendencies to sense desire, aversion, views, that is to say, all the problematic mental states. This is the end of taking up the rod and the sword, the end of quarrels, arguments, and fights, of accusations, divisive speech, and lies. So the key here appears to be to get ourselves to a place from which there appears to be nothing worth approving or welcoming or getting attached to with respect to our views and opinions. That is, oftentimes or usually, it's our approval and attachment to and welcoming of our own views and opinions that leads to this kind of mental rumination. So if we can get ourselves to a place where we're no longer attached to these views and opinions, where we're no longer welcoming them, and indeed where we're also not hating them or being averse to them or pushing them away, if we can get to this middle place with respect to our views and opinions, then we're going to reach where the Buddha says we should be. What is this place? This place is a kind of equanimity with respect to our views and opinions, our own beliefs. Equanimity with respect to these beliefs. And once we can reach that kind of equanimity, then we're in a place from which these kinds of mental obsessions will no longer tend to arise. But then the question is, how do we get to such a place of equanimity with respect to our beliefs and opinions? In many ways, the answer to this is the answer to the heart of Buddhist practice. That is to say, this is what we're trying to do, part of the essence of what we're trying to do when we're involved in Buddhist practice. And that is to say that this path towards equanimity here is not going to be simple, it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be quick, it's going to take time. And so to kick that off or to keep that going, to help focus our efforts, what I want to do here is to give these three different practices, three different mental states that we can take in our practice that'll be helpful along this path. To begin with, the first practice is to become aware of the dukkha of views and opinions, or the unsatisfactory nature of our own beliefs. I think the problem is that when we come to our beliefs, we think of them as permanent. We think of them as something that we can grasp onto, that gives us a firm anchor in this world. But if we reflect back upon our past, we're going to realize that our views and opinions actually come and go with some frequency. That there are many things that we perhaps used to believe in the past that we no longer believe. And the opposite, things that we didn't believe in the past that we believe now. We'll begin to be aware of the fact that views come and go. So for example, many years ago I had quite different opinions about a lot of things. Now I used to sort of think that the good life was a life of sense pleasures, more or less. That was all there really was. I no longer believe that. I used to have all kinds of political beliefs that I no longer hold. And I used to hold them quite strongly in a way that I don't anymore. So in my own life, I know that this is the case. Now, what I would suggest you do is to reflect upon your own life and see to what extent your views have changed. Now, if you're a younger person, if you're just getting these views formulated sort of for the first time, as it were, in your life, you may not be aware of quite so much change. And then I would simply counsel you to keep this in the back of your mind. Because even if you're very young and these views are just crystallizing now, in 10 or 20 years, you're going to look back and realize how much things have changed. And you're going to realize that perhaps in the next 10 or 20 years that your views will change in various respects. So I think many of us do think of views and opinions as a kind of a secure refuge, as something that's not full of dukkha or suffering, as something that's not unsatisfactory, as something we can really grasp onto. But if we begin to reflect upon them as changeable, as I suggest, we'll begin to see that views and opinions aren't really such a secure refuge after all, that they can let us down, that we can be mistaken about things, that we can change in our views and opinions. And of course, sometimes our views and opinions can be true, can be healthy, successful, skillful, and sometimes they're not. And we're basically not always able to tell the difference. That's part of the problem of the human condition. I also suggest we think about the sciences, which are perhaps our most, generally speaking, our most secure form of constructing beliefs and opinions that we have. And if we look back on the sciences, we'll realize in the history of the sciences how much things have changed, how much scientific opinion is always changing. Something as basic as human nutrition. Scientific views about human nutrition have changed quite a bit over the last several decades. Human nutrition is a very complex topic, and one that is difficult to get a handle on, and one for which there's not a lot of good evidence, even though it's something that's in front of us all the time. So if we reflect back on the progress of the sciences, we'll realize that what we take from the sciences as being true, as being something believable, that really reflects consensus among the scientists who study that topic most assiduously. And that consensus over the decades and centuries has changed in many ways. As I say, in nutrition it's changed quite a bit. In, let's say, physics, it's changed less. There have been a number of revolutions within physics, something that a number of scholars have talked about over the decades, but even so, in the last several decades, physics hasn't changed that much. And even though the physics of everyday objects around us is something that we can be pretty secure about believing, about Newton's laws of motion and so on, when we get deeper and deeper into the subjects of physics, things change. And so even something as secure as scientific knowledge is, when we look at it, always provisional. It's never secure. It's never a secure refuge. It's not intended to be. And so even though there are certain things that are known, let's say, beyond a reasonable doubt, such as the truth of human-caused global warming, they're certainly known beyond a reasonable doubt, and their contraries have been debunked beyond a reasonable doubt, there's always going to be that room for error, just as there is in any court case where we have to decide something beyond a reasonable doubt. There's always going to be room for error. And even though, in a political and social sense, it would be malpractice not to follow what the scientists say about, let's say, global warming, nevertheless, that isn't to say that the scientists are always right, much the reverse. Scientists, everything that we take from the sciences is taken provisionally. So this is to say that since beliefs aren't a secure refuge, since they are themselves, to a respect, unsatisfactory in that regard, we can relax around them a little bit. Now the second technique, mental operation, I think we can come to when it comes to beliefs and views, is to think of them in terms of non-self. That is, it's, I think, normally the case that when we think about beliefs and opinions, we think of them as mine, the belief being my belief, something that even defines who I am. I'm the person that believes these things. Or that we hold to a belief because we think that we've come up with it. It's my belief because I constructed it. I was the first person to have this belief. But if we reflect upon the origin of beliefs, we'll begin to realize that they don't arise due to any kind of willpower on our behalf. They don't arise volitionally. We can't produce a belief. They simply arise of their own in our mind stream. They pop up whether we want them or not. Indeed, many of the beliefs that we hold, I would submit, are beliefs that we don't want to have, that we don't particularly enjoy, that we find painful or unpleasant. We're surrounded by unpleasantness in the world that we believe because it's in front of us, it's in front of our eyes, it comes through our perceptions. And I think coming at beliefs this way, we'll begin to see that they aren't ours, they're not under our control in any respect. And so not being under our control, there's a sense in which they're not the sorts of things that we should identify ourselves with. Because again, we have no control over what they are, over when they will arise, over when they will cease to arise, when they will pass away. So essentially, beliefs are part of the furniture of the world that we inhabit, along with trees and flowers and tables and chairs. They're simply part of our world. Also, it can be very unskillful to identify ourselves with our beliefs because, as we have already seen in what I discussed previously, our beliefs tend to change. And it can be very painful for us to change beliefs, or when beliefs do change on their own, if we have identified ourselves with that belief. So for example, I would say one good example of this occurs when people change religions, when people leave a particular religious belief. There is often, in many forms of present-day religion, intended to be a very strong connection between how one sees oneself and how one has a particular kind of religious belief. That is to say, one identifies oneself as a person with these kinds of religious beliefs. Having done that, it makes it all the more difficult, all the more painful when a person converts to a different religion or deconverts, leaves a religion. It may even be difficult if they join a religion, if they've identified themselves as somebody non-religious. If they identify themselves as somebody who is, a strong secularist in the same way, and think of them, that's how they identify themselves. All of these simply make the ordinary transformations of belief that we all undergo more difficult. Indeed, this is one of the ways that religions use to keep people in the fold. That insofar as the religion reinforces this kind of identity between yourself and your belief, they're making it harder for you to then renounce that belief, if it happens, because it will happen to some people. And what they're trying to do is to thwart that possibility by making this attachment all the stronger. Also, if we're able to separate ourselves from our beliefs, that is to say, to cease identifying with our beliefs, to cease seeing our beliefs as who we are, then we're less likely to take it personally when our beliefs are criticized, as they ordinarily will be from time to time. If we identify ourselves very strongly with our beliefs, then we tend to take it personally, because when they're criticizing our beliefs, they're criticizing us. They're criticizing who we supposedly are. But if we can undo that attachment, then that tendency to take things personally will itself tend to evaporate. Now, the third technique I think we can use to minimize the role of conflict in our lives is to see the dangers in attachment to our views and opinions, to our beliefs. It's to understand that it's through our attachment to opinions and beliefs and views that we get into arguments with people. We can perhaps reflect back on our own behavior at previous times in our lives, where we have maybe gotten into arguments, where we have gotten upset or angry with somebody because they disagreed with us in some way. That we have gotten into an argument with family, with friends, co-workers, over beliefs. Now, again, I don't want to deny that there's anything wrong. I don't want to deny there's anything wrong with arguing with somebody on a matter that you disagree about, but there's argument and argument. And what we're discussing here is the argument that involves conflict. That is to say, where anger and hatred arise, where enmity arises for somebody else. And those can arise, at least for a time, in ourselves when we argue in this way, if we take these things personally. And I think we can reflect not only on how this kind of conflict can happen in our own lives, but how similar kinds of conflicts have happened at the national or international or global scale. That arguments over beliefs and views and opinions have resulted in wars that have lasted years and even decades long, that have killed thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. That attachment to views in this respect has grave dangers. It's the kind of thing that actually does result in terrible suffering, or at least can in extreme circumstances. Perhaps you can reflect and feel in yourself the kind of stress and worry that arises due to your own attachment to your own beliefs. Now, particularly if you reflect upon the possibility or actuality of somebody else disagreeing with you. And so this stress and worry is also another danger that comes from attachment to beliefs. That is to say, as we grow more attached to our beliefs, we tend to foster or condition the arising of stress within ourselves. We tend to condition the arising of worry within ourselves because we have something to defend against. And this is one of the ways, one of the practices that we can see that at the beginning of this video I discussed living wiser and kinder and calmer lives. Becoming aware of these roots of conflict through views and opinions is one way that we can help to foster kindness with others and foster calm in our own lives by beginning to see the dangers in attachment in this respect. What techniques can we then use to realize these three practices? What techniques can we use to help us to see the changeable nature of beliefs, the unsatisfactory nature of beliefs, the way that beliefs aren't who we are? What I would suggest is mindful reflection on the one hand, or regular mindful reflections, and mindfulness practice. I think these two kinds of techniques can help us to cement these realizations over time. The Buddha himself talked about how if a person doesn't find anything worth approving, welcoming, or getting attached to in the source from which these mental proliferations arise, just this is the end of the unskillful underlying tendencies that we have. The source of these mental proliferations or mental obsessions that torment us sometimes is in our beliefs that are strongly held, in our perception of the world being a certain way or that the world should be a certain way. So what we want to do here is to sit with these three kinds of practices I've talked about here over a period of time. It's going to be a very slow and steady progress, but it's going to take time, but it's the sort of thing that we can put into practice right now. Now, where are we going to end up with this? We're not going to end up in saying that we shouldn't believe anything. That clearly would not be skillful. Certainly the Buddha himself believed all kinds of things, even while he was awakened. He certainly couldn't have taught anyone if he didn't believe anything. So the point is not to have no beliefs. The point is rather to hold beliefs in a more skillful way. To come to be aware that our beliefs are not who we are, that we have no attachment to them, we have no emotional investment in them, They simply are. They're part of the furniture of the world. Sometimes they're true, or at least skillful, and sometimes perhaps they're not, and in the latter case we hope to learn why not so that we can change them. That's going to be our process. Our process is going to be one of relaxing our grip around our beliefs, of holding our beliefs more lightly, so that we can come to a more skillful and calmer approach to the world, so that therefore, through that, we can come to a kinder presence among other people with whom we may have differences of opinion. And so in so doing, come to a relaxation around conflict so that it arises less often, or perhaps not at all. I did an earlier video on what the Buddha had to say about beliefs in particular. It was one of my early videos, but I'll put a link to it up here on the screen in case you want to learn more. Thanks so much for all of your attention. If you're getting anything out of these videos, please do check out my Patreon page. It's linked down below in the notes. Join us if you'd like. We'd love to have you. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.